right, good evening, everybody. I hope everybody's feeling somewhat better fueled. I hope everybody's feeling a little more fueled, appropriately watered, and ready for our distinguished keynote panel taking place momentarily. We have a bit of a deviation from expectations. Please feel free to sit to make yourselves comfortable. So we will be having a presentation to start by Dr. Christina Hoyka, who I'll introduce in a moment, followed by a bit more of a brief presentation and conversational roundtable with the other distinguished members of our keynote panel this evening. And I'm really very pleased that everybody has given us some time this evening and has shown a willingness to come out and participate in this event. I will do abbreviated biographies for our distinguished panelists this evening, and then I'm going to clear out of the way for a few minutes and turn the floor over to Professor Hoyka. And after that, I will return and we'll do a bit of moderation. So to begin with, our first presenter on this final panel of our long, but I hope very fulfilling day, Dr. Christina Hoyka is an associate professor in the Department of Geography and Department of Civil Engineering here at the University of Victoria. Dr. Hoyka holds the Canada Research Chair in Urban Planning for Climate Change. She has degrees in engineering, environmental studies, and geography, and combines these perspectives into both teaching and research. Her current areas of focus are to combine the fields of energy geography and sustainability transitions in order to investigate the actions of communities and the demand side in mitigating climate change. Moving down the table, in no particular order, we have Ms. Lise Gaudin. Ms. Gaudin is an accomplished professional serving as the Director of Environment and Sustainable Management at the Department of National Defense. She spearheads policy development on environmental compliance and climate change to support military operations while minimizing their environmental impact. With a wealth of experience in both the federal public service and the private sector, Elise brings a diverse perspective to her current role. Her science, engineering, and education degrees, combined with years of audit experience, uniquely position her to build business management skills within the STEM community so that they can then successfully operate in the corporate world. Her multifaceted expertise and dedication make her a driving force in advancing sustainable practices. Next, we have, on the next page, Dean Murdoch. Mayor Dean Murdoch has served as the mayor of the District of Saanich, where we're currently standing, but only by a couple of meters. We're just inside the border since 2022. Prior to becoming mayor, Dean served 3 terms on Saanich Council. He worked for the provincial government at the Ministries of Health and Transportation and Infrastructure, and was an instructor of political science at Camosun College. Dean grew up here in Saanich and attended the University of Victoria, where he received a BA and MA in social sciences. Next, we have Rear Admiral C.A. Robinson. Rear Admiral Robinson grew up in Hudson, Quebec. He began his military career in the Canadian Army Reserves as a combat engineer, serving in the 3rd Field Engineer Regiment in Montreal. He subsequently joined the Royal Canadian Navy and underwent naval warfare officer training aboard patrol craft, minesweepers, and destroyers before volunteering for the Silent Service. Rear Admiral Robinson was appointed as the inaugural Commander Submarine Sea Training in 2011 and served in that role until 2014. He was appointed as Commander of the Canadian Submarine Force and Commander 4th Maritime Operations Group in 2017 and relinquished the appointment 2 years later. Feeling fortunate to have had the opportunity to serve as Commander of Canadian Fleet Atlantic between 2021 and 2022, he was appointed Commander Maritime Forces Pacific and Joint Task Force Pacific in May of 2022. And then at the far end of the table, we have Professor Michael Byers. I shouldn't have said his name before I had his bio in front of me. Professor Byers holds the Canada Research Chair in Global Politics and International Law at the University of British Columbia. Dr. Byers has been a Fellow of Jesus College, Oxford University, professor of law at Duke University, visiting professor at the universities of Cape Town, Tel Aviv, Nord in Norway, and Novosibirsk in Russia, and senior global fellow at the University of St. Andrews. He is the author of International Law and the Arctic, published by Cambridge University Press in 2013, and more recently co-author of Who Owns Outer Space, published by Cambridge University Press in 2023. And I personally, and on behalf of everybody here, we're grateful for all of you agreeing to participate this evening and giving us your time. Thank you so much. So to begin with, I will turn the floor over to Professor Hoika, who will give her presentation here, and I have lost the back of it.
Can I bring the,
It's a clicker, yeah. Yeah, that'd be perfect, just perfect. And it's the down arrow, not the up arrow, which was a source of some confusion earlier.
Okay,
there you go. All right.
Excellent. Let me try to adjust the mic so I can also see the screen a little bit better. Hi, it's nice to meet everyone here. I do not consider myself a scholar of security. So what I came up with was are some thoughts about some of the trends that I see as an energy geographer that I believe will impact energy security in our transition to mitigate climate change. Okay, I really need to see it though. So do you mind if I bring the computer over?
Just take that mic off. You can take the mic.
Oh, great. This is great. Okay. So I'm going to talk about 5 things. The impacts of climate change on electricity security, the challenge of electrification and security of supply, electrification and localized constraints, which is the big problem going forward, the distribution of socioeconomic benefits and justice and social acceptance and how those are tied together. And then finally, the lack of diversity and the need for widespread localized innovation. Those are what I see as 5 challenges. Oop. Okay. So for those of you who are here for the heat wave in June 2021, that was my introduction to Victoria. And one of the things that happened was that the transmission cables that transmit, there are 3 of them that come to the island that bring all of our electricity here. And they melted, a couple of them melted, and these are specialized cables that come from Norway. So we have a really big issue around security of electricity supply on the island as impact on climate change. We don't have enough localized supply. And this is the kind of thing that's going to happen in a lot of different places. Climate change is impacting electricity infrastructure that was built for an old system and needs to be modernized for a new system. And there's a lot of costs and transitions that have to happen with that. The other piece is that most scenarios and reports right now, they're saying that if we want to mitigate climate change, we need to electrify as much as possible. And the 2 really big areas that we need to electrify are transportation and heating. Those are 2 really big sectors globally that are contributing carbon emissions significantly. And what that means is in Canada, our electricity system would have to grow by 2 to 3 times. So try to picture that growth. It has to double or triple in size, which is massive. In the United States, in their medium and high scenarios, they said that that would increase the size of the system by about 20 to 38%, although I think that's probably an underestimate of the size of electrification. So this is an unprecedented absolute growth in annual electricity consumption, and it will significantly alter supply-side infrastructure development requirements. What it means is that we will need 2 to 3 times generation, transmission, and distribution lines in order to meet our decarbonized needs. So I'll give an example that's local again. In British Columbia, this is on the right-hand side, That's a chart from Pembina Institute, and I'm doing some work with Indigenous First Nations in BC around renewable energy generation. And so there was a report that came out called Clean BC, and that has the provincial climate change targets that are legally binding. And in order to meet those, we would have to electrify heating and transportation. So up at this top bar is all of the electricity that's required by 2030. But this green bar is what BC Hydro, the monopoly utility, had planned for. And so there's been a debate going on in BC about this massive gap, potential shortage of supply by 2030. And if you know anything about electricity infrastructure, it takes like at least a decade to get things going and to get things built. So this is pretty dramatic. And BC has just announced a massive spending program in this area. But in terms of the broader picture, California and the US have just launched a whole bunch of mandates around zero-emission vehicles, which is going to end up being electric vehicles. And so BC has an interconnected system with the US, and what's going to happen, I think, is that there's going to be a lot more supply crunches, localized supply crunches across electricity markets as the demand for electricity increases everywhere. And so BC may not be able to rely on the American supply, but the American supply may also be demanding more from BC. So how this is gonna happen, all of these different regions are potentially gonna be impacting each other, and it's not something that we really, as far as I know, have a very clear picture of. Okay. Oh, I was gonna have animation with this, but that's okay. One of the other things that's gonna happen, my energy geography brain tells me, is that where are we going to have all of this growth of transport and heating electrification? It's going to happen inside city boundaries. And so we're gonna have growth in cities, and then we're also going to have most of those transitions happening inside cities. And cities are not actually physically able to produce their own electricity, particularly if it's renewable, because renewables take up a much larger landscape than traditional sources like coal or nuclear. And so cities are going to be relying on regions if they're relying on renewable electricity. And of course, there's a lot of other competing options, but none of those options are on the market yet in a widespread way. Like green hydrogen is not particularly available, and neither is carbon capture, utilization, and storage, or small modular reactors also are not currently on the market. So if we're looking at what's on the market, cities will probably be relying on regions, and we confirm this empirically with some of our research. And what this does is it provides opportunities for new economic relationships between cities and regions. But how those relationships are defined, how those business opportunities are set up, and who benefits and who doesn't, will have an impact on justice. But just to give a more detailed look at this, this is Toronto. These are transmission lines, major transmission lines into the city. And for anyone who's lived in Toronto, there's massive condo towers going up there. Lots and lots of 30-story, 50-story condo towers going up. And what happened here was the city of Toronto went to the electricity utility and said, we're not gonna have enough electricity supply to supply all of these condominiums going in and this massive increase in demand. And so this is just one example of what's happening here and how that's only going to expand as we add more electric vehicles, more heat pumps, and more electrification. So the distribution of socioeconomic benefits is also an issue that affects supply, because the transition is estimated to be like $125 trillion, no big deal, to transition our global energy system to decarbonize it. And there's going to be a spatial rollout, like where all of that technology goes is going to have impacts on equity considerations and on justice. The distribution of the benefits and the negative impacts are going to be highly affected by that. And social acceptance of new infrastructure tends to be tied to the control over decision-making and getting the local socioeconomic benefits of those projects. And so sometimes some scholars are asking, are benefits local and collective for a community, or are they distant and private for a networked community of interest? And that's a question we need to be asking in our decarbonization, because it's going to be very uneven spatially. So right now, for example, a master's student in my lab is looking at how are cities engaging in a just renewable energy transition for regional communities. So he's looking at business relationships where cities are procuring renewable energy from regions, and he's looking particularly for instances in which the citizens are receiving more just outcomes rather than less just outcomes, depending on how the decision-making and socioeconomic benefits are distributed. And that is something that we barely know anything about. There's just very, very little scholarship or even practice in knowing that. And right now, for example, it's affecting cities like Los Angeles. Okay, the last risk that I see, or security issue, is the lack of diversity and the need for widespread localized innovation. This comes out of my 20 years in the sector, teaching in the sector for 15 years, and researching. The energy sector is one of the least diverse sectors. And climate and energy policy have long been dominated by technocratic solutions formulated within decision-making circles that lack gender diversity. It's one of the most gender imbalanced sectors in the world, and women account for as little as 10% of the workforce and 32% of the renewable energy workforce. And so a few people are arguing that we need to incorporate gender perspectives, but also we need to incorporate other historically marginalized groups. So what I have on the right, this is a renewable energy cluster. It's hard to see, but I've got a whole research program focused on how these are emerging, and the new European legislation is promoting renewable energy by promoting these types of clusters. It's clusters of all types of innovations. And what you can see here, if you look really carefully, is like lots of different types of people and businesses are all in there. And so if we're going to transition the global energy system, we need lots of people and lots of businesses and lots of communities involved in it. We need social innovation and energy transitions in a huge range of ways to make it work. And I guess my argument is, and this is the argument of quite a few other people, is that we don't have diversity in the net zero carbon economy. So early work looked at gender diversity and the huge lack of gender diversity. Very little is measured in terms of factors like racial or cultural diversity, but that's even lower where it's looked at. But I recently did research for the McConnell Foundation, and we found that very few organizations are addressing historically marginalized groups in the net zero carbon economy. And of all of the groups that are operating in the net zero carbon economy who could get philanthropic funds, very few are led by historically marginalized groups. That is one major indication that we don't have diversity operating in this energy climate change transition. And so an open question I have is, how are we going to get to this in all places and have all of the social innovation that we need when we don't have all of the different social sectors or groups of people involved in that transition? And I think that that's a big risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Hoyka. Our next speaker, I'll ask Elise Godin to take the podium. Would you like to have the microphone here, or would you like to walk around with it?
This is good. Let me put, so I'm a maritimer. The danger is I could talk all day, so I need to put a timer. Okay, so yes, I'm Elise, and you're wondering, what do I do? It's a bit of a mystery, even within national defense. So my team sets policy for the armed forces and the civilian side when it comes to environment. And we focus on two areas. So what we call the traditional environmental side, things that are legislated. So the Impact Assessment Act, Canadian Environmental Protection Act, Species at Risk Act, anything legislated. And we do respect Section 91 and 92 of the Constitution. My friend's not listening.
Oh, I'm listening. My point is you could still respect Section 91.
So these things are legislated, they're mandatory, and when it comes to planning in the federal government, they're number one. The second thing we do is we set policy. So policy comes second. What's in that? Climate change, greenhouse gas emissions and reducing them, things like so one of the policy instruments that we use is we respond to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And some of them have to do with climate change. Canada abides by this through the Federal Sustainable Development Act, and then the FSDS, the strategy for this, and then every department in town has to write a departmental strategy for how they're going to do this. So my team went about and developed, you may have seen this thing, the Defense, Climate, and Sustainability Strategy. We renamed it because through this iteration, the Deputy Minister felt that we could use this as a vehicle to add the national safety security angle as well and mirror what our allies had done. So the front end of the document has got an introduction from that angle, and part of the instructions in government is you don't duplicate something that's in the other document. So the targets have to do with NSS are in other defense policy documents. The other part of this document focuses on policy commitments. So not the first part that I talked about, which is the traditional environmental things. And this is where you see mitigation elements, reducing greenhouse gases, both from mostly real property and the NSS equipment, the military equipment. You'll also see things like doing climate change vulnerability assessments and then the more detailed risk assessments. And I heard some people talking about they're using 10 square kilometers, so do we. What does this mean? You keep asking yourselves, where's she going with this? Well, there's all of these activities going on in defense, and the way things work, if you read the National Defense Act, you've got the civilian side and you've got the military side. The Chief of Defense Staff reports to the minister, who reports to the Prime Minister. And means and capability are on a need-to-know basis. That's why you don't get access to certain things. On the civilian side, we take care of meeting the military's requirements. So if they need a ship with particular capabilities, the civilian side, in what we call ADM material management, ADM MAT, will go and use these functional requirements and go through a process to acquire ships for the military that are safe, as environmentally responsible as you can be, without putting the sailors' lives at risk. And it gets kind of tenuous and complicated because through decades of political parties taking power and bringing their platforms to life, the public service responds to that government of the day and implements. The government, the elected officials, decide what is going to happen, not the how. So we go and we find ways of implementing that works with the web of rules. Now, what's these web of rules, you're asking? They're public. They're on the Treasury Board Secretariat site. And these rules have been built through decades of pressure from Canadians, their expectations as to what government should do. They include things like GBA plus analysis. You may not be aware, but there is a requirement for the last year to add a climate lens to every new proposal going to the Treasury Board. Treasury Board is 6 ministers, in case you don't know. It's a part of the cabinet. And every proposal gets greening or an environmental annex to it now. That's been this way for a while. Every proposal, could be a Treasury Board submission or memorandum to cabinet, gets a strategic environmental assessment review. And this has been in existence for over 20 years. Every project that meets the criteria gets a proper environmental impact assessment. So there's a lot of things in the machinery of government that are set up. And when you layer these on top of each other, no wonder it takes like 10 years to buy some aircraft. So this is a result of a democratic society, a democratic country. We get a say in, and I'm putting myself in the taxpayer position right now, we get a say in how and what our government is going to do. We choose our politicians and they follow through. We've got a few challenges in this defense, climate, and sustainability strategy. One is every government is interested in being reelected. It's just part of what they do. So to garner votes, they come up with programs, and we call those external-facing programs. Things like the dental plan that's rolling out. Social safety net programs. That gets attention, and people will buy into it. The part that doesn't get any attention is investing in government infrastructure, the military equipment we need to be able to do what we're supposed to do. And defense's role is pretty clear. It's like we defend Canada's interests abroad and also domestically. So the processes to be equipped to do that are quite onerous. The equipment that we know we're going to have and that we have today is still going to be in use in 2050. There is no taxpayer appetite to get to the 2% GDP. So the elected officials make choices based on this. If the equipment we have now is what's going to be in use in 2050, what's coming out of the tailpipe is going to be the same. The only chance we have is for things like sustainable aviation fuel. And naval distillate, by the way, still has to follow the mil spec, F76, and biodiesel is excluded because it's got some percentage of water that is corrosive, and you don't want that on a ship. But naval distillate is still better than what most commercial operations are using. So we're as green as we can be without messing up the equipment, the engines, and making sure that the soldiers can operate these things safely. Because, don't We've got 3 military members in here. They're putting their lives on the line. This is not like, they're not playing dominoes. This is serious business. The other aspect that's difficult is investing in government infrastructure. So D&D operates on about 2.2 million hectares of land. We have thousands and thousands of kilometers of roadways, bridges, airstrips. We've got equipment sitting on spots that I can't mention because of security things, where I'm worried that the permafrost, I know it's melting, it's no longer permafrost, it's doing freeze-thaw. Will these things start doing the Tower of Pisa things? We've got airstrips where there are now sinkholes underneath and huge dips where an aircraft landing on that, you're going to kill people. There is no appetite to invest internally because that doesn't necessarily give you the desired result as an elected official. So it is a challenge. It's not easy, but if it was easy, it would have been done by now. And I tell that to my team all the time. They go, oh, this is hard, this is hard. And I'm like, if it was easy, it would have been done by now. So we have to be crafty. We have to network. We have to leverage things. We have to work with our CAF colleagues and be pragmatic. Part of my job is to deal with regulators. The other part is to deal with Treasury Board Secretariat, which are the public servants, not the Treasury Board 6 ministers, and inject a dose of reality. Because we were joking around a bit earlier about they were pushing for electric tanks. And they thought this was a great idea. But if a regular vehicle hauling the weight of a battery plus, the vehicle itself can bring you 500 kilometers, what size battery do you need in the tank in order to be able to go as far as you want? Plus, they're not necessarily, they're well-meaning, sometimes they're not informed, because when the tank is just parked there and you want it to be silent, you're not going to be running a diesel motor. You go electric. So there's advocating, there's pushing for improvement. It's probably the most challenging environmental file within the government. We are half of the footprint, like Dr. Greaves said. And if we succeed, the government succeeds at greening itself. If we fail, the government fails. So it's complicated is the answer. And that's where I will end it.
Always leave them wanting more, they say, right? So thank you so much, Elise. Next, it's my pleasure to invite up Mayor Dean Murdoch.
Thank you very much, Dr. Greaves. I know him as Will, so it's a treat for me to get to use Dr. Greaves. When I had a look at the bios of my fellow panelists, I thought, I wonder how many other people Will invited who declined before he got to me. I think it's because I was local and I was going to keep the travel bill down. It is a real honor and a privilege to join my fellow panelists today and the opportunity to participate in this conference. I was delighted to get the invite and even more delighted to have the opportunity to talk from a local government perspective. I think what you're probably noticing about the panelists is that there's a range of impacts that are being shared with you this evening, and certainly, as was touched on with the initial presentation, some of those impacts, I think, are felt most acutely at the local level. Communities are going to experience the impacts of a changing climate. Climate change is delivering more extreme weather events that have a significant impact on our infrastructure and natural systems, driving up costs and impacting our health and well-being. The heat dome, as was mentioned in 2021, was the deadliest weather event in BC's history. We all have been impacted for several summers in a row by poor air quality due to wildfire smoke. Even in areas that have not experienced wildfire, we can be inundated with some very congested air. These disrupt our ability to enjoy summers, and more importantly, they put a strain on our healthcare system as people seek healthcare remedies for the impacts from the respiratory impacts. Our ecosystems don't have the same technical fixes that we may be able to avail ourselves to. And for example, when it's hot, we can seek air-conditioned rooms if we're fortunate enough to be able to afford them. But trees, salmon, and wildlife don't have the same luxury. Our rural Saanich farmers are also facing the impacts of climate change. And as a municipality that has a lot of coastline, we're acutely aware of the impacts of sea level rise in low-lying areas. We're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. And climate change will impact different members of our community differently. Not all residents can access climate-friendly home and transportation options as easily as others can. And that's why in Saanich, we've centered climate equity in our approach and are looking to help fill the gaps in existing programs, reducing barriers to low-income households and BIPOC residents, and others in our community to ensure that everyone can benefit equitably from investments in climate action. So I'm happy to provide you, this is the fun part of being in politics, I'm happy to deliver some of the solutions we're bringing forward in the hope that we can curtail our contribution to greenhouse gas emissions and mitigate the impacts of a changing climate. Perhaps the most effective tool that local governments have at its disposal is land use. And one of the things that we can do to try and reduce our impact is to concentrate growth in compact, complete communities. Focusing the development of new residences in centers and corridors, supporting more climate-friendly transportation choices like walking, biking, and public transit, and more energy-efficient multifamily and mixed-use buildings. This focuses a population in a smaller area, protecting our valuable natural assets within the community, including our forests, urban forests, ecosystems, and our agricultural lands. Reforestation of our urban forest and rural areas is another area that we are expanding, including adding to our urban and rural tree canopy and securing our natural spaces to ensure that we are investing in our natural resources as a response to what we anticipate will be an increasing number of flood events and heat events, and possibly snow and freezing weather events, believe it or not, even here in BC's capital. Our building retrofit strategy is our plan to reduce energy use and emissions from residential and commercial buildings, and buildings are the second largest source of greenhouse gas emissions in Saanich, second only to transportation. We've offered a fossil fuel to heat pump conversion interest-free loan program for individual homeowners and a new revitalization tax exemption, which makes it more affordable for residential and commercial building operators to upgrade their heating and cooling systems. This helps extend the life of those older buildings by making them more efficient and saving them from demolition and replacement with more costly, newer buildings. We also very recently had the provincial government adopt Saanich's highly successful e-bike incentive program. The district contributed funds to expand the reach of the new provincial program for e-bikes and cargo bikes that replaced motorized vehicle travel. With Saanich's top-up, I'm pleased to say that the program helped 237 Saanich residents make the switch to e-bikes as their primary way of getting around in 2023. Now, we know that these actions are only a small contribution towards curtailing our emissions and mitigating the impacts of a changing climate, but they're important investments for us to make. You're probably all very likely aware of the increasing costs for infrastructure. You're probably seeing it on your property tax bills, or maybe that's being translated to increased utility costs or rents. And that is in no small part due to the impacts of a changing climate. Not only are we facing off against inflationary drivers on the replacement cost for those particular kinds of investments, but Pipes are bigger, pumps need to be bigger, and we need to be making more strategic investments in our natural systems, including our streams, creeks, rivers, and our forests that support the ecosystems that will ultimately be the things that save us from those very significant impacts of a changing climate. So I'd like to leave folks with an element of hopefulness. I think that we're very fortunate in the district to have had some foresight in making some of these key investments. But as was mentioned, the easy stuff got done early. We changed all the light bulbs. We moved to electric vehicles in the fleet. We've tried to make conversions happen to heat pumps and other electrical systems in all of our major facilities. But it's leading those kinds of changes to renewables in the residential environment and in the transportation sector that are likely going to be our greatest challenge. And we've got a long way to go, but I do want to reassure you that we are making good progress. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Dean. And over to Admiral Robinson.
Hey, good evening, everyone. Just a show of hands, who's local to the island? Okay. So I sort of assumed that most people were going to be on the island, so I crafted my remarks exclusively around that. So I'm going to adjust somewhat on the fly as we go. But effectively, what I'm going to tell you is I'm going to tell you that the armed forces have a role, in keeping Canadians safe, both here and abroad, in times of sustained climate change, which induces turmoil and resource competition, and that we have a secondary objective of reducing our footprint as we do that. And that's kind of the two themes that I sort of built the conversation around. So, a little bit of background about myself. I grew up on a dairy farm. I have been a sailor for 32 years and see firsthand the dramatic impacts of the changing environment day in and day out. The average increase in the global ocean temperatures has probably the largest impact on what I do professionally, but we see it everywhere. I have two roles here. I am the military commander for the western part of Canada, what we call Joint Task Force Pacific, and that covers the domestic response within British Columbia. And what does that mean in real words? I do the search and rescue for the area. I respond to forest fires and floods, and interestingly enough, I do avalanche control up in Rogers Pass using howitzers to provoke avalanches. And I will say, that last year was a record year in a poor way of forest fires. And we had hundreds and hundreds of soldiers and sailors and aviators out fighting those fires. And I just this afternoon came back from Rogers Pass, where we're having the opposite problem. In an average year, we fire about 1,000 rounds of howitzer ammunition into the mountains to provoke avalanches, and we've done about 20% of that this year. And I would think that, probably wouldn't surprise anyone, the temperature outside when I came in was about 12 degrees. Pretty extraordinary. It's why we all love living here, those that live here. It kind of is what it is. So just a little bit of academic background. Navies have three roles, and there was an academic by the name of Ken Booth many, many years ago that sort of postulated that navies do three things. We fight wars, we do diplomacy, we do constabulary. I think the first two are sort of self-explanatory, and the constabulary really talks to enforcing rules and regulations so that we have an equitable and fair use of the global commons, which is bureaucratic speak for the oceans. So, with all that said, I'll sort of launch into the meat of what I'm going to say. I am tracking the time. It's about 25 after 6. I should wrap this up no later than 7:30. But, if you're feeling you need to stretch your legs or whatever, I won't feel offended. I'm a middle child, so I'm used to generally being ignored. So feel free to use your phones and all that kind of stuff. So climate change is, of course, tied to global security. And I don't think I have to convince anyone here that, the environment is changing, and it's changing much more rapidly and in inexplicable ways than I think would have been predicted. This will cause friction as the human race tries to mitigate the damage that's been done, and it also causes resource competition. Droughts, starvation, flooding, fires, unprecedented weather events, mass migration. It's all driving instability in the world, and in my line of work, instability is not good. It will cause both state and non-state actors to act in aggressive and unpredicted ways as they seek to monopolize water, food, fuel, or even just space for rapidly growing populations. I went to my favorite source, Dr. Google, and I went to a UN report, and it's predicting that by the 2080s, we'll be at 10.4 billion on this tiny little sphere that we all inhabit. That's going to be a challenge. That's page 1 of 14. So making good progress. I kid, of course. I'll keep it to within 10 minutes, plus or minus. We often talk about Canada having 20% of the world's supply of fresh water. Very true. But it's more than that. Much of our fresh water, of course, is trapped in ice or in solid form, and as that melts, that drives a whole bunch of competition up in the north. And when I mentioned at the beginning that we're noticing the global change in ocean temperatures, well, that has a real impact in where marine mammals and other inhabitants of the sea live. And as they move north, that then drives pollution and that kind of stuff north, and has an impact on all of our ways of life. So that's kind of the background. Instability, bad. Navy's role is to try and fight against instability and maintain international rules-based order. I'm going to park that for a quick second, although happy to come back to it in the Q&A. I'm going to switch a little bit to sort of the day in, day out work of what navies do. And what navies effectively do in peacetime is maintain supply lines so that when we go to our local shop, the stuff that we need to buy is delivered there. And we do that by enforcing international rules-based order and preventing state and non-state actors from interfering with that. And I think we're seeing a very real example today with the Houthi rebels. Is everyone tracking sort of the Houthi rebels? About 12% of global shipping passes in their neighborhood. They're acting out in certain ways in support of other countries in the region that have an interest in instability. And Canada and other nations like that kind of work to prevent that. I'm going to skip ahead because I've noticed that I'm already about 6 minutes into this, but I'm going to talk about our role in curbing our own emissions. And, the previous speaker sort of talked about leaving on a hopeful note. I will say that I live and work in Esquimalt. My office is on the water, and this is my 5th time living and working here. And a unique feature of this particular posting is I have orcas that come in and out of the harbor. And the orca presence on the southern coast here has increased. And one of the reasons it's increased is because we have, and not just we, the military, but we, the maritime industry, we've implemented things such as go slow zones. So the ships all participate in a voluntary speed reduction as they pass up the shipping lanes. We have cleaned up the harbor in Esquimalt, which has then brought in sea life, which has brought in otters. Harbor otters are apparently tasty for orcas, which has brought orcas in. So anyway, a good news story on the circle of life. But the Canadian Navy, we operate expensive, high-tech equipment that uses a lot of fuel, but we operate on a really large ocean. So I would say that, generally we've always paid a lot of attention to fuel efficiency, but today, more than ever, we're focused on that. And we mitigate that by things like better coatings on the bottom so you don't get buildup, regular cleanings, more efficient fuel engine, LED lights, all the kind of usual stuff. But as a previous speaker had said, all the easy things are done. So to make larger changes now is going to require entirely new ships, new technologies, and that kind of stuff. Although, on a hopeful note, some of the more advanced technologies that we all kind of take, for example, penicillin, microwave oven, internet, GPS as examples, probably near and dear to all of our hearts, all came out of this sort of military-industrial competition to make things better. And near and dear to my heart as a submariner, of course, is the advancement of alternate electrical power supplies. And I think you're going to see a crossover, a bleed over, if you will, of some military electrical generation, storage, and generation systems that are going to really help out. But I'm not going to talk about those super much, unless you want to ask me. So just for the local people, I did take a list here of things that we're doing. So specifically in Esquimalt, we have cleaned out the dry docks. We've done a waterfront and dry dock clean out effort that has made the harbor cleaner. We've dredged out the entire harbor, gotten rid of all hundreds of years of human debris and silt and all that kind of stuff. We changed the way we use the Benedict Island, which is a little island just off the coast here that we use for explosions. We have set up bubble curtains. So we actually have little generators down the bottom of the ocean. They create bubbles. And what the bubbles do is they trap the noise to prevent it from affecting marine mammals and that kind of stuff. Of course, we also work day in, day out. There are flights that fly out of the area and monitor fisheries. If you go and Google global fishing fleet, you will see satellite photos that make the middle of the ocean look as bright as this room, because there are fishing fleets out there just harvesting everything. So we participate in that kind of stuff. The last thing I'm going to leave you with, because I'm right at 10 minutes, is the northern saw-whet owl. Anyone know what it is? If you don't, go to Rocky Point Bird Observatory, D&D land, and we ban the owls every year, and I encourage you to go there and observe it. With that, I will leave you wanting more, or perhaps wanting less, as the case may be, and thanks for your attention.
And last on our docket, but certainly not least, Professor Michael Byers.
I'm going to stand up here in an effort to defeat the echo. So I have a really difficult challenge in that what I'm going to say is going to terrify everyone in this room, and yet I want to leave you with a glimmer of hope. And that's really tough. So from the beginning, I still have hope. So I first learned seriously about anthropogenic climate change in 2004 when I reviewed the Arctic Climate Impact Assessment for the London Review of Books. It was a tough read. It was compiled by more than 100 of the world's top climate scientists and a collection of indigenous elders from around the circumpolar north. It was the first truly rigorous scientific assessment of climate change focused on the Arctic, which of course by that time was already on the front lines of climate change. I decided I needed to learn more. In 2006, I sailed through the Northwest Passage on Canada's research icebreaker, the Amundsen. And I met two remarkable scientists who became good friends and co-authors. Louis Fortier, a marine biologist who founded ArcticNet, and Dave Barber, the world's leading physicist studying Arctic sea ice. And because of Louis and Dave and their colleagues, I learned about the powerful feedback loops in the Arctic that were contributing massively to climate change. So the fact that warming air was causing the ocean to become warmer, more solar energy was therefore flowing underneath the ice and melting it from below. Receding ice was allowing more solar energy to go into the water, and so on and so forth. And you have a feedback loop with the disappearance of the highly reflective mirror of Arctic sea ice and the replacement of it with dark ocean water. It's a very powerful feedback loop. It's absolutely pernicious, and it's happening still today. Another feedback loop, the melting of permafrost. Permafrost contains hundreds of millions of years of partially decomposed organic matter. Lots and lots of carbon. And when the permafrost melts, that ancient carbon begins to decompose abiotically, without oxygen. And one of the main products of that decomposition is methane, which is 22 times more powerful than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. And the permafrost is melting around the circumpolar Arctic. I mean, climate change is probably spiraling out of control just because of the melting permafrost. And Canada is the second largest country in the world. We have a lot of that permafrost within our borders. And then there are the forest fires. There's a lot of forest in BC, but there's more in the boreal forest, stretching across northern Canada and northern Russia in particular. And all of that carbon is going into the atmosphere and causing yet further warming. So that's terrifying enough to think that all this is happening, and a lot of it is happening within Canada's jurisdiction. 6 years ago, I took my interest in interdisciplinary research in a new direction and began co-researching and co-authoring with an astrophysicist. As you may have noticed, a lot of things have been happening in space in the last 6 or 7 years. When I started working on space, there were less than 2,000 operational satellites in orbit. There are now more than 6,000. In the last 6 years, filings for radio spectrum for satellites at the International Telecommunication Union have reached 1 million. There are companies and countries which, in total, plan to launch 1 million satellites. We only have 6,000 today. Now, satellites are great for a lot of things, like surveillance and communication, climate science, really useful things. But the satellites that are being launched today by companies like SpaceX with their Starlink constellation follow the consumer electronic product model of cheap, short-lived, and replaceable. So every Starlink satellite, which weighs about 500 kilograms, is designed for an operational life of just 5 years. And then it activates its thrusters and goes into a controlled deorbit trajectory and burns up during atmospheric reentry. And again, there are about 4,000 of these Starlink satellites up there. Elon Musk has permits to launch another 8,000 already and is planning for up to 40,000, just the one company. So, my astrophysics colleague, Aaron Boley, 3 years ago asked the question, what happens to these satellites? Because mass never disappears. They don't disappear when they burn up in the atmosphere. They turn into fine particulates. And the satellites are made almost entirely of aluminum. So in a paper that we published in 2021 in Nature's Scientific Reports, we asked whether all of these re-entering satellites could change the chemistry of the stratosphere, the upper reaches of the atmosphere. We didn't have the capability to actually verify this hypothesis. But we thought if you have thousands of tons of re-entering aluminum, and there isn't much aluminum at all in the upper atmosphere, meteoroids contain almost no aluminum, so the only other source, potential source, isn't putting aluminum there in large quantities. If you add all this aluminum, it starts to sound like a geoengineering experiment. Well, someone at NASA might have read our paper. NASA has a high altitude science plane. It's an old WB-57 from the 1950s that can fly up to 60,000 feet and sample the stratospheric downward winds that come down over Alaska in February and March of each year. So you can actually sample air from higher than 60,000 feet. You can sample air from 50 kilometers up. in these particular locations at that particular time. And they went up in this plane and they did a lot of sampling, and then they ran it all through a mass spectrometer. And guess what? In the upper atmosphere, where there is very little naturally occurring aluminum, there is now quite a bit of aluminum already. There are also some obscure chemicals like niobium, which are only found in the nozzles of rocket engines, because the rockets come back also and mostly burn up. So we know that spacecraft are doing this. Now, the stratosphere is a very dry place with relatively fragile conditions, including something called the ozone layer that you've probably heard of before. So one of the possibilities that needs to be investigated now is whether these aluminum particles are going to provide places where chemical reactions can take place that would destroy the ozone layer in the same way that other chemicals called chlorofluorocarbons were allowing these reactions to take place that in the 1980s caused the world to come together and adopt the Montreal Protocol. Now, all I can tell you right now is that we know that spacecraft are contributing to chemical changes in the upper atmosphere. It might be good, but it's probably bad. One might think that Elon Musk is conscious that he's engaged in a geoengineering experiment and just hasn't told anyone. That would make him like super, super smart and very, very irresponsible. But my point here is simply this: because of what we know about the science, about the unexpected feedback loops of human activities, the feedback loops in the Arctic, the feedback loop that appears to be emerging in the upper atmosphere, right? All of the good things that we're hearing from these people in government and the military, I mean, that's all great, but it's too little too late, right? We are screwed if we continue on our current path of trying to nudge down our emissions, to continue to subsidize the fossil fuel industry, to not take on the government of Alberta. We are screwed. That's the harsh reality. Now, where's the hope in all this, right? Where's the hope in all this? The hope in all this is that there are truly amazing scientists in the world who are drawing these connections. And there's also a new generation of young people who are not going to take this inaction on the part of their governments anymore. There are a billion Greta Thunbergs out there waiting to force change. Now, my concern is that it won't happen fast enough. My other concern is I will be labeled as part of a generation that let the planet down. But there's still hope. So when you listen to these people, it's all fine, it's all well, it's good that they're starting to do things. But don't just listen to them. Go into their faces and tell them that you want more, that you insist on more, and that they tell their bosses that you're not going to take it anymore. Thank you.
Thank you for that, Michael. How's everybody doing? So, in his comments, Dean commented briefly that there's like a real diversity of people up here at this keynote panel, and that's absolutely true, and I want to speak to that just for a moment before I toss a question in the direction of our panelists. Because the diversity of perspectives and professional roles and experiences and backgrounds that you see before you was purposeful. The goal that we had behind this keynote panel was to deliberately bring together a group of people who all shared as a starting point, an understanding that climate change is real, that it is happening, that it is serious, that it demands action, but then have a range of different perspectives on how much we've done, how much remains to be done, how far we've come, and different vantage points within their respective organizations from which to reflect on these questions. And as I've been listening with great appreciation, once again, for the time and expertise you're sharing with us, I do feel like I kind of put together a keynote panel that has the makings of a joke, right? Like what happens when two academics, a public servant, a mayor, and an admiral walk into a bar? Ouch. But it's precisely that diversity and precisely that range of opinions that we're hoping to excavate and that we want to bring into conversation together. The question that I'd like to ask each of you, all of you, not individually, is a question that comes by way of my students. Like many of you in this room, I am a professor and I work with young people all the time, and I won't speak on your behalf, but I'll speak on my own. It's very challenging to teach young people about climate change and climate change politics. I'm not a natural or physical scientist. I don't particularly dive into the physical, biophysical underpinnings, but I teach about the basic scientific foundations and then a lot about the social and political dynamics that flow from that. And that leads to a lot of really difficult conversations. And it leads to a lot of student anxiety, and it leads to a lot of angst. And that, of course, then imposes anxiety and angst on me, and here we go spiraling out of control. But it's inspired by one of the questions that I think is probably the most common question that I get from students when I'm teaching this material, because the chronology that I teach always goes something like this. I usually start somewhere around the 1950s. We talk about the big post-Second World War industrial boom, the growth of the suburbs, the rise of the private automobile, the massive expansion of our urban and human footprints, very much in North America, very much in Canada, but really globally. Then I fast forward a little bit, I skip over some of the boring parts, and I talk about 1988, when the Toronto Conference on the Changing Atmosphere was the first international meeting of scientists and policymakers seeking to grapple with this problem. Then I talk about 1992 and the signing of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. And then I talk about 1997 and the Kyoto Protocol to that convention. And then we talk about 2009 and the Copenhagen Accord that didn't really do very much. Then we talk about 2015 and the Paris Agreement, which we continue to invest a lot of hope and expectation in as the vehicle for multilateral climate change action that will finally help bend this curve. And by the time I'm done narrating that chronology, what I get from a lot of students is, if this is something that everybody who cares to know about has known about since 1988 at least, and many people, of course, knew far, far sooner than that. But for students in our classrooms today who, I'm horrified to say, were born in 2002 and 2003 and 2004, right? It challenges them to come to terms with the fact that this is not new, that this is not an unknown emergent phenomenon, that every day it feels, every year, new reports, new science, new awareness of the gravity of the problem, but that's all layering upon a foundation that is almost as old as I am, and yet here we are having these conversations. And so the question that I have for our distinguished panelists is the question of not so much looking backwards at the obstacles that have stopped us from making better progress up until now, but with respect of your own distinct vantage points, the organizations that you work with, the community partners whom you work with, the people whom you interact with every day, what is stopping us or slowing us from making the progress that we need to going forward? That's the question I would love for you each to take a crack at asking. Perhaps we could start with Professor Hoyka and go down the row. And then at the end of that, I would be very pleased to take some questions from the floor and put them to our guests this evening. So I will pass the microphone along, and thank you very much.
Not a hard question at all. In 2022, I ended up in the national media with a group of academics over a debate around carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and I spoke with the media across Canada, print, radio, a bunch of different things. And what really surprised me was that there was a really big lack of knowledge around the current state of energy technology and innovation. And this is including, like, the International Energy Agency is considered a very conservative body, and yet even their reports are showing that renewable energy is the cheapest, fastest growing technology on the market. So what's slowing us from progress? I guess, why don't the media know what the International Energy Agency writes about and is putting out there? That was a hard year for me after doing all of that media. A lot of my work is about, how we can move forward. And so I think probably denial. And that was my first encounter, really, of obstruction, obstruction of knowledge and information. And so I think that is what is slowing us. And to talk about students, I had a teaching evaluation done in my first class, and it was noted that I talked about really hard-hitting feelings about climate change. But one of the things that I talk about, because I look at climate change mitigation and adaptation, is that the very first class, I talk about the quality of sources that you use. Why do we have peer review? What is peer review? What information is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change based on? Why does it matter which source of information you use and why that source of information is credible? And so I give them a list of organizations that are like green light organizations to get gray literature from. And then outside of those, I recommend students check with me and otherwise use peer review. But peer review can be very slow to come out because of the process. And I do that because I talk about how factually the fossil fuel industry has obstructed advancement in this area. They have funded their own research, just like tobacco companies told everybody it was safe to smoke. And I treat this as a fact. This is a fact. Historians have researched this and told us this, and we know this is happening right now. So what's slowing us from progress is, unfortunately, what slowed us in the past. It's obstruction and denial, because we, as complex as what I talked about that transition is going to be, we still have a really good idea of the first steps that we have to take. And we also know that there, at least in the near future, a lot of them are very cost effective. Thanks.
What is stopping us? So I was actually in high school, and this was before 1988, and we were taught about the greenhouse gas effect. So it's been around a long time. It's nothing new. And through the years I've thought about, why are we not acting on this? Or why are the actions that are being taken not sufficient? And I'm a bit of a philosopher, so looking at this, I kind of went, this is human behavior. It is part of so many cultures, and it comes in through different cognitive biases that all of us do these things to varying degrees. So one of them is proximity bias. You can think of a family member, a friend, someone you know, maybe yourself, maybe you had a bike accident, and for the next while, I guarantee every one of us here who's going to get on a bike is going to be a bit extra careful. A few weeks will go by, and the memory will fade a bit, and then we'll go back to our old habits. So every time there's a disaster and opulentus triggers the military to go help, the effect of that, gets imprinted on you. But it fades away, is what happened with the town in the interior BC just being decimated by wildfire. Are the nearby towns reacting the same way? They were close, but I'm pretty sure that the residents there are viewing it more as, we got away with not being burned down to the ground. Phew. So proximity bias is part of it. Loss aversion is another one. So this requires a change. And human nature is to try to aim for stability. Go for what you know. Predictability is good. How do I change? What do I need to do? Is this going to put my family's income at risk? You worry about these things. Loss aversion is a big effect. This abstract concept of in the future something bad is going to happen, that's too far away, so it fails the proximity test. And it's too abstract. It's really hard to describe what it's going to be. We're taking educated guesses. Science is kind of narrowing down and saying exactly what it's going to be, but until we get to that 2050, 2100, we don't know exactly what it's going to be. So that's part of it. You've seen those ads on television, social media, where people are asking for help. There's a kitten, he's been hit by a car, the SPCA, the Humane Society has him, and you feel you can actually help because you see the kitten, or children who are impacted by things. You feel that what you can do is going to help. It's small enough that you can wrap your brain around it and you can see how your contribution will make something positive. When you think of climate change, it's so huge that a lot of people feel helpless. Like, what can I do? It's happening. There's just so many of us not doing anything. What can I do? So that plays into it. And when we speak to people who are not understanding the science of this, they feel helpless. And we don't necessarily help because we're talking about disasters and droughts and all of these awful things, instead of telling them, you need to do A, B, and C. And if half of us do this, it'll be better. If 3/4 of us do it, it'll be even better. If all of us do it, it'll be yes. So we need to switch up a bit how we speak to people who are not in our practitioner community. We focus on what's different rather than what we have in common and what we can do in common. And just to give you an example, I used to live in Halifax. In Halifax, I was the French lady because I'm actually a francophone. They only saw what was different. Then I moved to, j'ai déménagé à Montréal. Okay, I'm sitting in Montreal, all of a sudden I was the English lady. I'm like, I'm the same person. I'm half and half. But they would see the difference rather than what was the same. Human nature is, I think, the obstacle. We have these behavior patterns and these biases that are just piling up on top of each other, and with the misinformation out there, it's really hard to figure out who to believe. It's really hard to figure out what do I do next, because TikTok is going to tell you what to do now. So human nature is, to me, is, part of what I hear you say, Dr. Greaves, is a lot. I relate to a lot of it because I see a lot of problems with, we're all trying to do the best we can. We've got our little routines every day, and who lifts their head up to kind of go, hey, what's going on in this area that's not my domain of expertise? No, we got our little thing going. So human nature.
Thank you. I agree with much of what's been said. I can answer the question from a local government perspective and what we encounter on a regular basis. It's not a lack of will, it's not a lack of understanding. In Saanich, we were one of the first municipalities to adopt a climate action plan going on 2 decades ago. And as I said in my remarks earlier, it was the easy stuff that happened fast, and now it's the hard stuff that's going to be slow. I don't think it's a lack of willingness on the part of government. Certainly among the 8 colleagues I have on council, we are unanimous in our view that we need to take serious action to reduce our emissions and to prepare ourselves for the impacts of the changing climate. But I think probably funding is the greatest obstacle. We're already facing extraordinarily high infrastructure costs just because of inflation. And then when you factor in the growing need for infrastructure replacement and investment as a result of a changing climate, and that's not just the pipes and pumps, that's the buildings, that's the transportation network, that's all of those surface level infrastructure investments that need to be made. You will strain very quickly the availability of local governments to pay with almost exclusive ability to tax on property, on the value of property. And if you want to bore an audience, get into a debate about which level of government has the best level of taxation. But I can tell you it's not the local governments. We're already facing extraordinarily high costs, and I think were the funding available in greater amounts from senior governments, we would be able to go a lot further, a lot faster. Similarly, households, I think, are facing exceedingly high costs just to put food on the table and a roof over the heads of the people who live in those homes. And for them, the idea of investing in a heat pump, buying an electric car, switching to an e-bike, are all nice to haves, but not something that fits in their budget. And they're going to rely on government support in order to make those conversion, making the switch in lifestyle choices that would allow them to also reduce their emissions. And the only way they're going to be able to do that is if we're all levels of government acting together to fund those kinds of investments so that collectively we can be doing everything we can to reduce our emissions. So I think it's certainly not a lack of willingness, it's not a lack of awareness, but it's going to take really a wartime effort of investment in order to accelerate the kinds of changes that we need to have in place urgently.
So often when I'm driving on the road, I see those white and black signs that warn you to stay in your lane. And I will say straight off the top that I am a military officer who works for a democratically elected government and follows the direction and implements the direction. Caveat off the top. I'm going to say, from long time observing things, is that it is kind of human nature to have a short-term focus. And if you accept that governments don't have unlimited resources, if they have $1 to spend, there are many, many deserving places to spend that dollar. And I will say, from the federal perspective, it's an almost unlimited amount of places to spend that money, all the way from the new dental care plan, which I think is awesome, through to supporting municipalities who struggle to raise the funds necessary to exercise the responsibilities that they have. So the short-term focus, I think, is human nature for sure, but it doesn't help us solve things that have been going on since, at least since 1988, so before I was born for sure. Kidding. I will say, as someone who joined the Navy, because I grew up on a dairy farm, and my horizon was literally the horizon, right? You had to be back to milk the cows twice a day. So I had an intense desire to see the world, which is in common with many, many people. You cannot underestimate or oversell the global poverty that a large part of this population lives in. It is shocking. Often I have pulled into ports and clearly, people, little kids with their distended bellies because they haven't eaten in days, being swarmed by flies, animal carcasses floating by in the freshwater stream. Like, the poverty in the world is shocking. And it is entirely normal that they would prioritize, as would we, their next meal and getting clear drinking water long before what could appear to be nebulous in the sort of medium-term future. So I'm always cognizant not to be preaching from my place of privilege, living in probably the best place in the world, certainly a very blessed country, lecturing less fortunate nations on what they need to do, even though it's, the evidence is fairly clear. We need to come together as a global society and do something, and we need to do it really quick. I will say that self-interest versus community good is something that is also a very nebulous concept to understand. And I think that we all learned that lesson 3 years ago with the pandemic. I would imagine, and I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but most people in here are vaccinated. But the pushback against vaccines and why should I get vaccinated if everyone else is vaccinated, and that kind of thinking doesn't lead to solving existential problems such as global climate change. But I will sort of park that one. Two short ones at the end. As was already said by one of the panelists, change is hard. And in the Navy, we often joke that, there's two things that sailors really hate. The first being the way things are now, and the second, of course, being change. I will finish as a vegetarian. I'm just going to say one really tangible thing we could all do is stop eating meat, but I'll leave it there.
Just a couple of very quick comments. First of all, the countries of the Global South are not responsible for climate change in any significant way. It's the countries of the developed North. And we're pretty prominent among them, despite our relatively small population. So, no, I'm not lecturing the Global South. I'm lecturing our government. Our government. The other thing is, human nature must be different in Western Europe, because I spent last summer traveling around Europe by train, and they've made the transition in places like Denmark and France and Switzerland. Yes, they're small countries, they don't have our punishingly cold winters, but they have radically changed their energy systems. They are decades ahead of us. And these are democratic countries. They're not federal countries, yes, I'll grant you that, but it's not human nature. It's not human nature. It's a lack of political courage. So my message to everyone is speak up loudly, not angrily, but loudly and cogently every chance you get. What happened at lunch today? I went to Will and I said, you really shouldn't be serving beef at a climate conference. Yeah? How many other people spoke up about that? How many other people noticed the irony? Yeah. Yeah. Next time, just speak up. I wasn't impolite. It wasn't your fault. But I can assure you that Will Greaves is never going to organize another conference with beef on the menu, and I made a small change by speaking up. Never miss the opportunity to do the right thing. We are in a crisis, and human nature is not the problem. It's the fact that we haven't demanded loudly and consistently the urgency, the imperative for change.
Well, between steak on the menu and my Twitter habit, it's really been a day for Will, let me tell you that. I would love to open the floor to some questions. Ali, would you mind grabbing the microphone, please? Thank you very much. We do have around 20 minutes or so that our panelists have generously committed themselves to. I'll bar the entrance. So if you would like to ask a question, please put your hand up and Ali can bring you the microphone over. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, so this is a question for Admiral Robinson and Elsa Gooden. Also, Elsa Gooden, Maritime, who's your father?
Never mind. We're struggling to understand
We can't hear.
So this is a question for Elsie Gooden and the Admiral, and then I asked, who's your father? Because you're a maritimer, and I'm from Halifax. But anyways, yeah, so...
accent joke. Yeah.
All right, I'm just going to stop the humor for the rest of this conference and never be funny again. But on a more important note, so you're talking about procurement. It takes 10 years. What we're doing now, we're going to be using out to the 2050s. Obviously, you know, the ships of the Canadian Navy are mostly diesel-based. Has there been any focus on using small modular reactors as that technology comes online next decade, given that procurement processes are going to take 10 years? You know, rough back of the Excel spreadsheet calculations, you know, you could, with the new sort of eVinci Westinghouse like microreactor that's supposed to come into commercial use in the early 2030s, you could, with 4 of those, which, and they're not that big, they're like the size of that table, power like a destroyer, right? So has there been any interest in in order to decarbonize the Canadian naval fleet, switching over to a nuclear base in the next procurement options for ships?
Do you have any existing SMRs as part of, that's, okay, thanks.
I can only answer part of that. So these small modular nuclear reactors is something that we've looked at, but I can't say that we're committed to it. There are implications beyond just simply popping a unit somewhere. And one of the requirements is this has to be soldier-proof. So we've got young people who join the military, and anything we deploy has to work with whatever they do. So I'll give you an example. We have aircraft hangars where we built these fancy systems for lighting and closing the doors to be energy efficient. And the design, the company that built it didn't think of the people using it. And what happened was they'd be under the aircraft trying to fix things. The lights would go off. So they'd put a fan up with a ribbon so that they could work safely and see under the aircraft. It's not a simple answer. It is something, though, that is being looked at. As far as ships, I am going to have to defer to my colleague.
So I will say that naval procurement and the word nuclear have a troubled history in Canada. And the Department of National Defense in the 80s and 90s and into the early noughts funded a fair amount of research into smaller modular reactors, seeing this as, you know, a really good way to have a sustainable power source. For ships in particular, it's all about fuel energy density. Whether small modular reactors are going to be the way forward for that or not, I can't tell you. But to answer the straightforward question, do we have one? We do not.
The panel is turning on us.
Actually, I'm going to jump in on that. So I was talking about the International Energy Agency and, you know, me talking to reporters and them not knowing. So I've been asking about nuclear small modular reactors for quite a few years because I was at the COP 25 and 26. So according to the nuclear industry at those COPs, small modular reactors are really only in prototype mode. There's a huge number of challenges to scaling those up and making them affordable. So I did a little like, hey, Twitter, can anybody tell me about nuclear SMRs and where they're installed? And anyone here who knows more than I do, let me know, but I heard like Russian military vessels is where they're installed. Now, in terms of Canada, and this is again where I'm concerned about the rhetoric around which tech is market ready and which tech is not. What was his name? The person from Project Drawdown, Jonathan Foley, he just came, and in his talk he said, nuclear SMRs have been a decade away for several decades. Canada there's been a lot of push for nuclear SMRs in northern communities, despite the fact that Canada has only just announced investment in the first nuclear SMR in Canada. On the IEA technological readiness scale, nuclear SMRs are about halfway down. They're not close to technological readiness, and the market's not close, and it's a matter of a wide range of factors that will get them close. So knowing all of that, the most likely place that I can see a nuclear SMR being implemented because of the cost would be in military installations. And so that's a really interesting response to get. So thanks for letting me intervene.
Although I will.
Yeah. And if you know more, I want to know.
I don't. I know. So without going way down a track on nuclear reactors, it depends how you define a small modular reactor as well, right? There are hundreds and hundreds of nuclear reactors in the world today that would fit between this table and the windows. So is that a small modular reactor? Yes, no. We generally accept that SMRs use unenriched uranium, whereas predominantly the military ones use enriched uranium, which has nuclear proliferation challenges. But certainly it's a technology we're watching. Another technology that has received a fair amount of your tax dollars via the Defense Department is fuel cells, and Ballard in particular, local here, received about $100 million in funding from the Defense over the last 30 years to progress fuel cells, which I think also have a lot of promise. But to go back to the north, as someone who spent a lot of time up in the north, and many people don't realize, all those small towns up north produce their electricity with diesel fuel, which is just kind of awful, but I digress.
Hi, Shaila Fetzig from the International Institute for Strategic Studies. My question is also about the defense energy transition. I didn't hear a lot of optimism, and I think there's a lot of energy behind this agenda right now, but perhaps bumping into some of the realities, such as on the industry side, their shareholders don't want industry to move faster than absolutely necessary on developing green defense technologies, because it cuts into their returns, essentially. So my question is really about what is a scenario in which defense actually does achieve its emission reduction targets somewhat on time? What would need to be in place in order for that to actually happen? And yeah, I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
So that's an interesting question because it comes back to money. So for example, we've put the Halifax Central Heating Plant up on proposal year after year to get approval to upgrade it, transform it. That project alone is $400 million. And every time it gets refused and we put it in the next year, the costs go up. It is our biggest source of emissions at the moment. Part of the problem is the Nova Scotia grid is not totally green. So the utility itself has still got some higher emission energy sources in it. That's just one central heating plant, $400 million. If we start factoring in that national defense has got about 13,000 buildings that are things like hangars and messes and offices and maintenance buildings, among other things, and you add another 8,000 soldier housing units, the amount of money needed to transform the older portfolio, because that's where the problem is. It's not the new buildings that are the problem. They come in and all new designs are net zero. It's the older portfolio. Every single one of us in this room, can you imagine how much more we'd have to pay in taxes just to cover the national defense real property portfolio. We're about half a government, so double that. And some of these buildings are very specialized and use a lot of power. So back to Halifax, and I don't get English jokes, I'm a francophone, désolé. So we're putting in a facility in Halifax that is going to be designed to net zero. It needs a lot of juice. We have an extra $10 million, if not more, to pay to get the utility to bring in a power line to us. If that doesn't happen, it is Canadians, citizens of the area, who lose power. So we'll pay to get the line in, but it's very clear that the province and the municipality are riding on us to subsidize improving the electric grid in the area. We've got Cold Lake. Again, the province of Alberta has refused to put in a new power line to the base. We're running a CHP, a central heating plant, where there goes another $400 million to bring it up to spec. You just keep multiplying that, and the dollars add up, and they add up. At some point, something's going to have to give, because climate change is going to come, and it hits an area, and it doesn't sort of draw a little circle around a defense base or wing and avoid it. It's going to wallop the base. Back to Halifax. Fiona hit it. There was no power at the Navy Yard. There was flooding. If you know Halifax, there's an installation that's along on the basin, the water line. The climate models I have are predicting that the water line is going to be above the structures. It's going to cover the rail line that gets the train into Halifax. It cuts through the yard. And we have no means of accessing dollars to be ready, because the government machinery doesn't work that fast. So it responds to problems. Unlike the Netherlands, where they're into prevention, which is great, North America is big into reaction. So the biggest challenge we have is dollars, and how do you divide up something to all of these programs that have been promised to Canadians, to industry, to the provincial governments and such. Like, we're talking trillions of dollars here. Now, if something comes along and wallops one of the bases, we're in trouble, because if the province triggers the Public Safety Emergencies Act, then they push the easy button, op lentis. Phone call gets made, someone talks to the Treasury Board ministers, the Department of Finance gets in, and they say, yes, we will fund the armed forces to go help you. But if they can't deploy out of that base, what help will they be? So there is this weird little circular reference happening, where we're supposed to be the first responder for the country. We do not have the mandate of the American National Guard. We're pulling soldiers away from what we need them to do. There's a lack of money, and like, this is complex. I have by no means any solution that would get anywhere near solving this. But I think there's enough brains around to do something collectively. We just sort of have to gang up. Someone else want to add something? Someone else has got some spare change to help us out?
Student and then...
Sorry, priorities.
Of course. Thank you so much for your comments so far. The panel's been really interesting. I have a question for Dr. Hoyka, and apologies, it's kind of BC specific. You mentioned clean BC policy objectives and a supply shortage by 2030. And kind of the electrification dilemma that keeps me up at night is if all of the approved by the provincial government LNG projects or new pipelines do get built and are necessarily electrified, what does that mean, or does that change the energy security dilemma that you presented to us here? And has that modeling been done by researchers or by the government to see how that impacts the security of our electricity? Thanks.
That's a good question. I don't know the whole answer because my focus has really been around, my research team was contracted to work for a group of First Nations who are advocating to generate more electricity and to have control over that. That said, in our research, some of the projects and some of the generation that we're developing is about powering LNG, and I don't know the exact amount, but it's quite large, and so it depends on where the grid, close to the grid it's connected, and then how it's being contracted. I think in terms of modeling, that modeling was done by Pembina, and that was specifically about the climate change goals and the gap. And so there's been a huge announcement by the government now. But in terms of the amount that has to happen, it's gonna get messy. And what I talked about, it's gonna be really complex because there's going to be a need for new transmission and figuring out where those things go. I've spoken with someone, for example, I'm moving into looking at hydrogen systems, and there's been a discussion that, for example, the amount of electricity would be produced by Site C, could that be converted to hydrogen, which is not very efficient conversion, in case you know electrolysis. So yes, and it can be a distraction to electrify to support fossil fuel development. But that's not a part that we've been looking at. One thing in my results, though, that we found really interesting was that one of the First Nations we interviewed, we were asking them, okay, well, what's the benefits of renewable energy? And one nation said, well, it was a really good way for us to dip our toe into energy infrastructure projects, because then when a pipeline came through, we felt a lot more confident to dive into that project, to that fossil fuel project. And what's happening right now is that a lot of the conversation is moving towards energy infrastructure, inclusive of both electricity and fossil fuels. And so the idea of, in the case of First Nations, jumping in, a lot of the conversations around access to capital are around all types of energy infrastructure, which is interesting. So that definitely doesn't answer your question. I'd be really doubtful if there's modeling around the LNG piece, because Pembina did modeling because there was so little modeling, because it was really contentious to call BC Hydro out and to say, BC Hydro, you're not planning enough. And I've just been an outsider since I've come and really learning about the different actors, so.
I think we have time for one last question, so over to you.
Hi, my name's Emma Fingler. I'm with Queen's University. My question is for Mayor Murdoch. I find that in the past, in my research, in the past kind of decade or so, there's been this transition towards a focus on localization and getting knowledge from local communities and how that can help not only local government, but work our way up, or even from the top and asking down at the bottom, well, what can we do better? As a representative of that local community. Have you found this kind of newfound focus on the local level a burden on the community itself? Or have you found that it allows you to have a different kind of platform in which to speak about your issues, or on the other hand, greater responsibility but with the same amount of funding?
When you talk about localization, can you tell me a little bit more about what you mean by that?
Yeah, I mean more so a responsibility of outside groups or groups of different levels of government who come in and ask the local community what they need or how they can be more resilient, if we're talking about climate in particular, of asking the local community, well, what would you do in this situation? But oftentimes there's a gap between asking and doing. And oftentimes it falls on the local community to do the doing when somebody else is asking what they need.
That's a very astute analysis of what is going on in local communities. I think that there's the creation of expectations around the ability to deliver results based on asking that question. And then there's no follow through on the ability to actually deliver. And so I think that sets up local governments to be the responders, to be the ones to enable some of those key actions that representatives in our community might be looking for us to undertake. And that's exceedingly challenging when you have a limited amount of resources, especially in smaller communities. I mean, I don't want to, the District of Saanich is very fortunate to be a fairly large community within BC. We're one of the largest suburban municipalities in the province. There are a lot of much smaller communities than Saanich who are struggling to be able to deliver results in the form of investments in infrastructure or grants or things that may be key enablers for lifestyle changes or investments that people could make that would reduce their emissions. So I think that's, in a lot of cases, left local government on the hook without the ability to actually deliver. And that, I think when people are recognizing how quickly we're running up against the impacts of climate change, that only exacerbates that level of urgency and anxiety around it when you see that nobody's coming to save you.
Thank you.
I'm sure we could keep going, but both out of respect for our keynote panelist time and recognizing that some of us have been in this room for 11 and a half hours, I think that that's a really excellent note to draw this day to a close. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And thank you to all of you for taking time out of your lives and your schedules to be here for these conversations. I greatly appreciate your contributions, and I'm looking forward to those of you who have enough stamina to come back tomorrow and do it again. And I'll see many of you, I hope, not in this room, but in an adjacent room in the corridor, starting a little bit later, 8:30 to 9 for coffee and breakfast, and then a substantive start at 9 o'clock. And we're going to continue the discussions with the CSAC research fellows and our expert practitioners who are coming in tomorrow to talk about their own professional trajectories, working in, studying, and practicing in this space of climate change and security. Thank you all so much. Thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening.